I was sitting around the office one day looking through scripts, continuing to write, trying to get my feature film ideas off the ground, trying to get somebody to hire me. And my assistant, Nona Tyson, found Duel. She said, I read this article, this short story by Richard Matheson in Playboy magazine. I said, what do you think of reading Playboy magazine, Nona? Are you kidding? She said, no. But she said, I love the fiction. And she said, I want you to read the short story. I think this is right up your alley. And I read the short story and I said, wow, this is terrifying. This is like a Hitchcock movie. It's like Psycho with the birds, only it's on wheels. A truck chasing a salesman through the desert. And she said, well, I also found out that Richard Matheson is writing a screenplay that they're going to do as a movie of the week, and it's being produced by George Eckstein. She gave me all this information, so I called up George Eckstein, who didn't know me from Adam, knew of me because they used to call me Scheinberg's Folly, because I was the young kid he had hired. I think was the youngest person ever signed under a term contract in Universal's history, and I wasn't really that highly regarded. I was this abstract kind of young person that only loved lenses and dolly shots and didn't know anything about acting. That's at least the reputation I had then. And I called George Eckstein up and I said, I've read this short story, haven't read the script yet, I'd love to talk to you about this. And so he invited me over to his office and he asked for me to bring the work I was proudest of, so you can see an example of my most recent work. So I brought over the rough cut of Columbo, which hadn't even aired yet, but I brought the rough cut over. And I left him with the rough cut after we had his conversation. He saw the cut. Then he called me back to his office and he said, okay, give me your ideas and how you'd like to make this into a movie. And he gave me the script of Duel. And I read the script, and I came back, had another meeting with George, gave him all my ideas, and he said, well, I'll get back to you. And a day went by, 2 days went by, I didn't hear a thing. On the third day, I got a call from George, who said, okay, I'd like you to direct this. It was like the greatest phone call. It was the second greatest phone call I ever had. The first being when Scheinberg called me and got me out of college to you know, be a director. And the second one was when Eckstein called me and said, I'd like you to direct Duel. And that's sort of how it all began. I was intimately familiar with the work of Richard Matheson because I was a complete, obsessive, compulsive Twilight Zone follower. And so I knew of his work on The Twilight Zone and some of the really great episodes of that.
You are getting smaller.
Certainly I'm a big fan of The Incredible Shrinking Man, which he authored. I actually, in 1 week, got to meet him and Ray Bradbury for the first time, so it was kind of a banner week for me. My attraction to it wasn't because it was a horror movie and I didn't really see anything about it as a Western. I thought it was just a complete exercise in a cat-and-mouse game of classic suspense. And to give credit where credit is due, it's Richard Matheson that was very clear in his teleplay that you didn't see the driver. You might see a hand out the window telling him to go on into oncoming traffic. You might see his boots, but you would never see the face of the driver. That was Richard Matheson. And that attracted me more than anything else. The unseen is always more frightening than what you throw in the audience's face. Dennis Weaver was suggested by the studio because he had huge ratings from earlier films on TV. I love Dennis Weaver, and I actually had a vote in it. George Eckstein was actually saying, what do you think of this person? What do you think of that person? And it was great that they did that, because he brought me into the casting circle and let me consult on who the network wanted. And when Dennis's name came up, I immediately said, oh my God, it's gotta be Dennis Weaver. And I just went nuts. And George said, why are you so hot on Dennis Weaver? I said, you never saw Touch of Evil? You never saw The Motel Caretaker? It's the greatest. I went on, and I remember George saying, he was pretty good as Chester in Gunsmoke. I said, yeah, that was great, but look at the character roles he played in the movies, because I was a big fan of his from that one film. He reached a level of anxiety and panic in Touch of Evil and paranoia that I envisioned David Mann, the character who was playing Duel, arriving at in the last act of the story. That's where I wanted him to get to, was that character he played in Touch of Evil. And so when Dennis Weaver said yes, that was like one of the happiest days of my life. I knew I wanted the car to be red because in looking at the locations out in the desert was pretty much beige and brown and sort of earth colors. And I wanted the car to be able to stand out, to be able to pop in all the wide shots of the desert country. And so I just simply said, I don't care what the car is, but I want a red car. What happened was the art director had sort of a casting call for trucks. And I got into a little electric cart and motored back to the back lot, and there were about 7 semis waiting for me to kind of cast the star of Duel. And I walked up and down the trucks, and it was obvious the truck I chose, because the Peterbilt that I chose was a little more retro. It was an older truck. It had a face. The windows are the eyes, and it has a huge protruding snout, and the grill and the bumper are the mouth, you know, and it had a face. The other trucks that were on the back lot were the more flat-nosed, blunted trucks, you know, the ones that didn't really form anything but a large kind of conical cab where the window went straight down to the headlights. There was no engine sticking out in front. The engine was probably in the back. If you just tipped the cab forward, you could see the engine behind the driver's seat. I think that's how those trucks worked in those days. I'm not sure, but my eye went right to the one truck, and I said, you know, you got the part. First of all, I didn't quite know how I was going to achieve this in 10 days. They were giving me 10 days to shoot about 73 minutes of film with commercials. It fills out the hour and a half of the ABC Movie of the Week format. I didn't quite know how I could do this thing in 10 days. They assigned me a highly regarded production manager named Wallace Worsley. And Wallace was kind of gruff and tough. He was a pussycat on the inside, but on the outside he was a gruff and tough person who looked at me and often gave these derisive snorts of, yeah, prove it. Prove you can make this into a movie, because if you can't, your history, son, will bring somebody else in who can. And I really respected that he took a hard-line position with me, because I said to him, I'm going to shoot this all on location. And he said to me, you cannot shoot a movie of this scale on location in 10 days. You need to send somebody else out to shoot all these plates and do it on a soundstage with process. And I said, Wally, I don't want to shoot this if I have to go inside. It's going to look fake. You can look out all the windows of the car. It won't be a chase. It'll be a guy comfortably sitting on a soundstage with bad process out the windows, which is always out of sync with the way the grips move the car. The car moves this way, the process goes that way. It never works. And Wally said, if you spend the first half of the first day of shooting plates, so we have those banked, and then if you stay on schedule for the first 3 days, then you can shoot the whole thing on location. Otherwise, you got to come back to the studio. And I said, okay. And that was the thing I had to prove, that I could stay on schedule, so I didn't have to go back inside to make a real fake-looking movie inside. And I did stay on schedule enough to earn me the right to shoot the whole film outside. And where I did fall behind schedule in the last 3 or 4 days was where Wally Worsley said no one could have done that film in 10 days. We wound up shooting that in 12. I went maybe 13. I went 2 or 3 days over schedule on that, which made the studio not very happy, but I was getting good stuff.
Well, I'm never gonna make that appointment now.
In order to stay on schedule, I couldn't just do single setups. I knew I had to use multiple cameras. But there's only so many cameras you can put on so many mounts hanging off a car before that starts to look like process. And I wanted a lot of independent movement, so we got Pat Hustis to bring this camera car he invented and designed for the movie Bullet. And he brought this sort of a low racing car, insert car, that I was able to get these really cool low-angle shots of the truck and the car. And also was able to plot the shots, so I'd put 4 or 5 cameras on a mile stretch of road. So I would have, on 1 mile run of the truck chasing the car, I'd get 5 run-bys. They'd be all right to left. Then I simply took the cameras, took them to the other side of the road, which, by the way, looked completely different from the side of the road I was shooting. And when you simply just go to the other side of the road and look back the other way, I got 5 more shots when the truck and the car returned to their starting positions. That was sort of the way I was able to quickly shoot some of the chases in the film. What took time, of course, was when we're on the insert car and we're getting complicated shots moving in and out of the truck, you know, pulling ahead of the truck where the car comes in the shot, letting the car overtake us and going right into the grill, and with all the dead bugs that I put into the grill of the truck and splatter dead bugs across the windshield. Things like that took the time, but things like that created the suspense. They said, let's plot the entire 74-minute film on an overhead map so I can just plot my cameras. So we did kind of like a architect's overhead plan of all the highways in Pear Blossom and Soledad Canyon and Sand Canyon out in Palmdale where I shot Duel, and put all of these incidents, the cafe, the phone booth, and the snake farm, all the incidents or the set pieces along the road of the narrative, on this big overhead map, and it was a huge mural. It wrapped around the entire motel room that I was given to stay in for the time I shot on location. But I was able to every single day make notes on the map and plot what the menu was going to be to achieve that day, the day's work that I needed to achieve in order to stay on schedule and make a really good movie. I was able to do it from a bird's eye view looking straight down. I didn't really so much do individual storyboard frames. That would come later in my work, but on this film, that overview really helped me understand where I was. So when I jumped out of continuity, I knew exactly where I was. The truck was the antagonist. In the story, it had to have a personality. It couldn't just be a sparkling new, freshly minted truck. So the idea was to make the truck look like a veteran of these, road crimes. This was Murder Incorporated on wheels. So there was grease on the windows and fake dead bugs put all over the grill and on the windscreen and against the headlights. And the truck was painted oily and streaked with oil coming out of every single possible known vent on the truck. The truck was put into makeup every day. Dennis Weaver was in his makeup chair, and the truck had 7 or 8 people with large brushes and mops, spattering it and making it look really grisly and horrible. It was the same kind of makeup you would do on Frankenstein or the Wolf Man or the Phantom of the Opera. All those license plates were the states where he drove motorists into the ground, off cliffs, against guardrails. Those were the notches in his Colt 45. The intention was that he was basically a marauder in every state. Cary, who liked to be called Old Vaporlock, was a guy who I knew because I'm a big fan of all the old westerns, and Cary Lofton and Dale Van Sickle, who also worked on Duel, were 2 of the most famous stuntmen in the annals of Hollywood history. And I wanted Cary, and Cary then suggested bringing Dale along. Dale drove the car, and Cary drove the truck, and that was kind of the way it was. There's no hidden piece of, antiquity about Cary Lofton as a background character or standing by the roadside. He was just the truck driver. But he was a brilliant truck driver because I couldn't have gotten any of these shots if it weren't for how safely Cary drove that truck and yet made it look dangerous and frightening and deadly. But Cary was a very, very safe driver. And actually, in certain scenes, we couldn't get the truck to go very fast, so I had to use tricks like having the camera lower to the ground. And to create more speed from the truck, I always put cliff walls on, let's say, the east side of the highway. And then I'd be in the insert car with Pat Hustis driving, with Jack Marta, the DP, and the operator, and we'd be shooting toward the truck, but always with that cliff rushing by. And as you know, you don't have to go faster than 25 miles an hour. But if you shoot dead flat to a wall or an obstacle moving by, it makes the truck look like it's going 100 miles an hour. And the longer the lens is, the faster the truck looks. When I say longer the lens is, anything around, let's say, a 35 or a 50 look awfully good in terms of speed. If you went a little bit wider, as long as you didn't show the road, it still looked like you were going really fast if you stayed dead to the side. So many of those shots were just sort of shot slow, but cheated with geography moving back by very quickly. There's a couple shots that are sped up because the camera lost speed. The camera actually lost speed and went from 24 to about 12. And I didn't have any other coverage, and I was forced to use that.
What happened out there, mister?
I'll use your men's room, please.
Yeah, through the door, on the right, down the hall, turn left.
Part of the whole thing when he goes into the cafe was I continued to try to get the audience to sort of have a first-person experience with the Dennis Weaver character. And to that end, I thought by taking him out of the car and walking him through the cafe after he'd almost been killed, and he's shaking, he just wants to get some water on his face, and walking him into the bathroom, and then walking him back into the cafe, and then walking him all the way over to where he sits down. And then he looks out the window in the same shot, and the truck is parked across the street. And then he turns, that's our first cut, and every single person in that cafe is a suspect. And this is before the days of Steadicam, so that was simply a handheld Aeroflex. And we had to ADR everything. We had to, Foley everything because the camera was so loud, even if you put a blanket over it, it was still a handheld Aeroflex. But later on, it was very effective once we got the sound of the motor or the camera out of the picture and got the other Foleyed sounds in there. It sounded really good. What I learned from Hitchcock was don't ever let the audience off the hook. Be a whore about keeping the audience on tenterhooks as long as possible before giving them some clue or some kind of relief. And so if Hitchcock was ever whispering over my shoulder during the making of Duel, it was simply that. Don't answer these questions just because ABC has airtime problems and you've got an air date. Take your time and draw out the suspense as long as possible.
I don't know. All I did was pass this stupid rig a couple of times and he goes flying off the deep end. He has to be crazy.
In the morning he recorded the lines and we would just work with his dialogue on the Nagra, just playing right back to him from the actual Nagra, from that little small speaker on top of the machine.
Why didn't I leave right away when I saw his truck outside? Then I'd know what he intends to do.
It helped him react to his own thoughts. To have his voice played back to him was like having the thought occur spontaneously. So he was able to use those playbacks to be able to physicalize and emote what he was feeling.
Would you mind checking those radiator hoses?
I'll do that. Take a look at my snakes if you have time.
It was fun to take reptiles that people were afraid of and put them in the movie to just sort of add to the chaos and the anxiety of not only was the truck against him, but all the forces of natural law were against this character as well.
I'd like to report a truck driver that's been endangering my life.
Your name again?
David Mann.
There was no stuntman at all in that scene. The film was shot once. That particular angle was shot from two different angles with two cameras, perhaps a third camera, a real low shot on a hi-hat on a board. But Dennis was in the booth. That was all Dennis did himself, and Dennis was very insistent on driving the car, except for certain things where all of us ran and said, Dennis, you're not doing this next shot. But even at one point, Dennis goes up half a hill, and you can see out the whole front window like in a jet plane. The horizon line just goes like this radically and then recorrects. That's Dennis driving up the bank of a shoulder of a highway and back on the highway again. Dennis did a lot of his own driving, and Dennis was very proud of the fact that he was in that phone booth when the truck was coming. And he had plenty of time to get out, and it was practiced and rehearsed over and over and over again. And there was all sorts of fail-safe points. There were these stakes in the ground. And Kerry Lofton had his eye on little flags, which off camera, that meant the point of no return. That meant that if Kerry did not see Dennis leave the phone booth by the time the grill of his truck got to that red flag, Kerry simply was going to abort to the left. And there still would have been a lot of clearance between the booth and Kerry's aborted driving. But Dennis did it just at the right time. We only did it once. I didn't want to tempt fates and do it a second time. And Dennis got out of the phone booth so the truck didn't have to abort. It just went ahead and plowed into the phone booth.
Why did he bring my cages out?
Lucille Benson, I asked her to come back and do the same scene with John Belushi from Duel in 1941.
Fill her up. That's it.
Where?
What's the matter? Car trouble?
Well, in a way, yes. I wonder if you'd do me a favor.
What's that?
And then Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I used the two older people in the car from Duel. I used those same two actors in the helicopter in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Look, I'm a sap for nostalgia, you know what I'm saying? I like that. I like never forgetting, you know, the old ties. They had a dead man's clutch on the truck so the truck would continue to roll with nobody in the truck and hit the car and go off the cliff. I'm not quite sure how they accomplished that. I was busy on the cliffside setting 7 different positions. In the best spots I knew I could put the cameras because that was the only truck we had. We didn't have a take 2 on that. That was going to be the end of the movie. There was no reshooting after that scene was over. So I was very obsessed with getting all that right while Kerry and the physical effects people were up topside, getting the truck rigged to plow into the car and go off the cliff. I just know that when I saw dailies in that scene, I just used one of the 7 cameras all the way down because the shot was so extraordinary. There was one shot, I'm not sure who the operator was on that, the operator deserves a medal, who followed the truck and the car all the way down, including into a large plume of dust. And you would assume the shot would be over. But then the entire massive tanker part of the truck reemerges from that cloud and continues its journey down the cliff. It was just an extraordinary shot, and that had to be the only shot used. I don't think I saw any dailies because I was living out in Pear Blossom the entire time I was shooting Duel with the company. There was no time to really see dailies out there. We couldn't go back into town to see dailies, so I was just relying on lab reports to say that there was no hair in the gate and no negative scratches and the film was exposed properly, and I was relying on Jack Marta to tell me if he thought it was going to be okay, and I really relied on his expertise and his years of wisdom being a really good DP. But when the movie was over, I was faced with something uglier than just having not been able to see my own rushes. I was faced with the fact that I had 3.5 weeks to an air date from the day I wrapped the principal photography on Duel. There was 3 weeks and a couple of days to the time that story was going on ABC, Movie of the Week. So I couldn't just do it with one editor. And as a result, 5 editors worked on Duel, and I was like bicycling from editing room to editing room for the next 3.5 weeks. It was an amazing time. Each of these editors was really talented, and they did some great work on the show. And I remember a sequence that one of the editors created that wasn't even in the script or wasn't even in the way I shot the film, but he created a kind of tempo when the truck is finally bearing down on Dennis Weaver's character, and the truck is forcing Dennis to hit speeds of like 100 miles an hour, and there was never enough coverage, and he began stealing from other sequences to have enough footage to create a faster cutting rhythm to culminate in this crash where the car goes into the wall, you know, sort of totals itself or totals the front end of the wall before the climactic climb up the hill, before the climactic fall into the canyon. And he had created that scene unbeknownst to me that he was working this way. I came into the room and he said, "You want to see something?" I said, "Sure." And he showed me the sequence that just blew me away. Sound design is just a glove that goes over the hand of where the camera is positioned. Sound fits like a glove. It has to. It has to be a partner to everything you see and everything you sense. I mean, sound is going to make everything scarier.
Something wrong?
Sound is going to make everything, you know, more suspenseful. And with a silent movie is certainly not as suspenseful as being able to hear the creaks and groans in a haunted house with doors and windows opening and shutting. It's the same with Duel. It's a haunted truck movie almost. And here you have a guy sleeping by the train track. He's so exhausted he kind of passes out. And I put the sound of a truck into actually a visual of the train coming around the corner. So thrown way out of focus in the background is this object that comes into the rear window. And you can tell it's a train. It's red. The truck was never red. I always said, "Oh, I wish that train had been brown. It would have been a much better cheat for the audience." But you can tell it's a train. But I put the sound of the truck in. And you hear the truck, you hear the truck, you hear the truck, and suddenly, bang, it's the train going by. Dennis wakes up with a start. He screams. He grabs onto the wheel. And then the sound of the truck becomes the sound of the diesel freight. It passes, and then it starts to laugh. Just from sheer exhaustion and relief that he's still alive. And joy that he's alive, and he's laughing and laughing and laughing, and then he blithely just sort of moses on his way. The death of the truck is a little cheaper, I guess. I was a little bit more on the nose in those days, and I said, "This truck's like Godzilla, you know, let's get a dinosaur roar in there when the truck, you know, turns over and dies." It's the same sound I used when the shark dies in Jaws. I took the very same sound effect, the same moan that I had put into Duel when the truck is rolling over, comes out of that big cloud and continues its fall. That's where I put the prehistoric kind of groan. I took that same sound effect. It's kind of almost like a little bit of nostalgia, and I stuck that same sound effect into the last scene where the shark is blown up and the big carcass is sinking to the bottom of the ocean. That sound reoccurs there. put the sound at the same point that the fin of the shark comes out of the cloud of blood, like the truck came out of the cloud of dirt. And it was a little bit of a self-congratulatory pat on the back, but it was also kind of like saying, gee, thank you, Duel, for putting me on the map. Gee, thanks for giving me a career. And thanks for getting me started making movies, because without Duel, I wouldn't have gotten the green light to make Sugar Land Express when I did. So, you know, one thing always helps another, and I was just sort of turning backwards in time, having finished Jaws, to say thank you, Duel, for letting me have Jaws.
Well, it's about time, Charlie.
My God.
I see Billy Goldenberg's contribution to Duel as being very important because he didn't do a conventional score. He used African instruments, and he had low drums, and he had kind of like tubular bells. It was so experimental and so courageous to have a score like that, especially on an ABC Movie of the Week. I thought Billy did one of the best scores he had ever written for Duel. I think he was very inspired by the story and didn't want to do a conventional score. Didn't want a string section. He didn't want horns. He wanted it to be almost a kind of atmospheric feeling. He added so many layers of creepiness with his music that it really brought Duel up even further. I have a couple of appearances in the movie. For one thing, you know, I needed to be in the car sometimes with Dennis, so I sat in the back seat way over to the left. And on the television frame, I was fine, but when the film was eventually released overseas, on certain 1:8:5 aspect ratios, you can see part of me sitting in the back seat. They had to eventually take some of those prints and do a whole field blow-up to get me out of the movie. But there are other things they couldn't get me out. I didn't realize it. I'm inside the phone booth, reflected in the glass of the phone booth, when Dennis Weaver goes in to make the call to report the truck, trying to call the police. And there I am with the script in my hand, kind of like looking up and down, making sure that all the lines are right. And I'm in the phone booth, and there was no coverage. And by not seeing dailies every day, I didn't have the luxury of coming back the next day and, you know, filming it over again. It had huge ratings then. The ratings today would have been titanic, because today there are so many other distractions that the 4 big networks don't get the kind of ratings that the 3 big networks used to get in the 70s, when it was getting 35-40 share was something you just did if you were a hit show. You know, that wasn't extraordinary. If you got a 60 rating for Roots, that was extraordinary. Today's shows are actually renewed with ratings of 10 to 12 to 14, they're renewed, you know, and back then if you had a 14 share, you weren't renewed, you were gone after 2 episodes. So when the market share was larger and more people were watching just those 3 networks, we got a huge number. And then when the film went overseas as a feature film, after I went out and shot some extra footage to expand it to the legal limit of 90 minutes, they said you couldn't release a film overseas unless it was 90, and we were 74, so I went back and I shot that scene of Dennis Weaver, and it's a scene I kind of made up. I thought it would be a kind of cool scene. Dennis Weaver comes to a train track, and a train is passing, and the truck suddenly pulls up, appears behind him, and starts to push him into the moving freight train. And that was one of the expansion sequences for the European release. Duel unlocked the gateways of the continent of Europe. I never had been to Europe before, and I went to Europe for the first time. It was amazing. You know, non-stop flight from New York to Rome. Got to see the Spanish Steps, stay at the Hassler Hotel, and meet Federico Fellini the next day, who had just seen Duel. And I'm very proud of a picture I have that was taken the day after he saw Duel, and has his arm around me. We're standing in front of the Grand Hotel. I look like I'm as skinny as a rail, you know, and he looks as thin as he ever looked, and we're standing together, and we became friends from that moment on, and had infrequent but still contact from that time on.
Oh no, please, no!
I had sort of made a movie that was kind of the roadkill equivalent to High Noon, and the Europeans were reading in all this esoteric, abstract symbolism about class warfare in America. which kind of haunted me because when my first feature came out, which was about cars, again, the same critics said that Spielberg was attenuating those themes and carrying them even further. I was proving their point by making the Sugarland Express. But that's fine, because you know what it teaches you to do? It teaches you not to think so reasonably. It taught me to think a little more in the abstract. It really instructed me not to just look at something and say, okay, everybody is bound to see this picture the way I see this picture. We're going to see the same colors, the same sky and horizon. We're going to interpret this exactly alike. And I learned very early on that nobody ever sees the same picture the same way. It's impossible. I'm probably not the best kind of judge of how many sides I have as a picture maker. One film I can say I indulged myself in that was for me, or that's for the audience, that's popcorn, and that's brain food. I don't know if I'm the best judge of that, really, because I take all my movies seriously. I took Raiders of the Lost Ark seriously. I had to. I had to believe the story was really happening. If I thought it was a romp and a confection, then the film would have been a parody of the serials from the 1950s and 40s. But I took that story very, very seriously, and I wanted the audience to believe that Indiana Jones was actually going after the lost Ark of the Covenant, and when that Ark opened, the power of God was within and was going to wreak havoc on the Nazis. I mean, I believe that stuff, and I don't think you can be a filmmaker, a serious filmmaker, making audience popcorn movies unless you believe the stories you're telling. I haven't seen Duel in a long time, but I mean, my memory of Duel as a film is that I was really proud of it. I look back at it, number one, saying, how did I get all those shots in 12 or 13 days? How was that possible? To this day, I don't think I could do it again. If I had to go back right now and recreate Duel in 12, 13 days, I couldn't do it. It'd be impossible. I think I was so hungry back then. I was so ambitious. I was so excited about having been given this chance. I was so thankful to the studio, especially George Eckstein and Wally Worsley for supporting me in this. I even used Wally Worsley. He came in and he did other movies, he did E.T. with me. So I look back at it and say I couldn't do it that way again today, and I'm probably too smart to have done it that way again, which means a lot of the spontaneity would be left out. I would be the Europeans analyzing Duel and putting all those different levels of interpretation into it now. I think I'd be too headstrong about telling that story again. So sometimes you have to look back and say, you know, those early films are a mark and a measure of who I was back then. I mean, I'm not the same person today as I was back then. I always have held that nobody is the same person. Once you grow up and you have children, you have a family, and you learn more about the world you live in, and you make new friends, and you lose some old friends, I mean, you change. And I could never go back and make those early films as well as I made them when I was of the appropriate age and naivete to be working on subjects like that. But also, I couldn't have made Schindler's List or Private Ryan when I was 22, 23 years old either. So it's a fair trade-off.
The idea for Duel came to me on the day that President Kennedy was assassinated. A friend and I were playing golf over in Fillmore, and when we came in for lunch, we heard about the assassination. And we were so distressed by the news that, of course, we forgot about the golf game and started going home. And as we were going through this narrow pass on the way back home, this huge truck started tailgating us. And we went faster and faster. He went faster and faster. And we were screaming out the windows with as much fury about the assassination as about him trying to kill us. And finally, my friend pulled off into a dirt siding, and his car spun around. And this truck went flying past, and we were really shaken up by it. But having the true writer's mind, within a few moments, I thought, man gets chased by a truck. And I wrote on an envelope. I didn't even have a piece of paper with me. He had some mail there, and I wrote on the back of one of the envelopes the idea. And for a period of time, I presented the idea to a number of series on television, and they thought it was too limited. They said, no, there's just not enough there. And finally, I gave up on that idea, pitching it for a television idea, and wrote it as a novelette. and it was published in Playboy, and then Universal picked it up and I did the screenplay. When I wrote the story, Duel, to me it was just a straight suspense story. I named the main character Man with some sort of foolish idea that I was making a metaphor for mankind, which didn't last. The fact that you never saw the driver, which was in my script, but in my novelette, he saw his name on the side of the truck. His name was Keller, which I thought was a clever way of saying killer. But I never visualized it in any way as anything but a straight suspense story, what a normal man would do when presented with such a circumstance, how he would respond. And finally, of course, even though he was a totally non-heroic type, how he finally caused the man's destruction who had been trying to kill him.
Oh boy.
I'm a visual writer. When I wrote the story Duel, I saw it happening in my head like a movie, so I could transpose it to script form very easily. When I write a novel, I see it in front of my mind's eye as though I were watching a movie and I'm just describing the movie. So I am a visual writer, and I never had difficulty from the very start. When I finally decided to write it as a novelette, what I did was I drove from my house to Ventura and back with a tape recorder and just recorded everything I saw, because I knew I couldn't very well write a whole story and imagine what he saw. So that was very helpful. That's how I got the story written, because I had a route that he followed. I had no specific character image in my mind for the driver, except that this was like a pre-road rage story. What was interesting is that when I went to watch them shooting, several people came up to me and said the same thing had happened to them. In one case, a truck driver actually waved him on past and another car was coming in the other direction. At one point, I thought that there was not enough material in the novelette for a full-length television movie, which at that time was 90 minutes. So I thought perhaps I would have to have the man's wife with him, so there could be an interchange between them. And I don't know who talked me out of it, but I'm certainly glad they did, because it would not have worked well at all. It was much better the way it was. But there were scenes that were briefly told in the story, which I utilized and expanded them for the film. The sequence in the coffee shop was one of them. That was where I first met Stephen. And I went in the cafe, and it was so realistic. I thought, well, the cafe is open for the day, and they're just shooting around their real customers. I didn't realize that they were all actors, because they looked so good. They're so real.
Would you mind checking those radiator hoses?
I'll do that. Take a look at my snakes if you have time.
My wife and I, in driving across the country, had stopped at gas stations that had all these things, and so obviously it was our decision to put one in there. And then how it was staged was Stevens, the truck knocking over the phone, the tarantula on Dennis Weaver's leg. I know I had him trying to call the sheriff and the truck coming, so that was in the script. But all the little niceties of detail were Stevens. I believe they had difficulty finding someone to play the part, so as I was told, they shut down the series McCloud so that Dennis Weaver could do it. And I thought he was perfect for the part. I mean, he was every man. When he looked frightened, there's a scene of him going up the hill where the car goes slower and slower, and he's screaming at it, and Stephen has these extreme close-ups of it. It really is nerve-wracking.
Please, please.
When you examine it, it isn't really a duel until the very last few moments of the script. It's like a flight before that. flight from terror and a flight from a nemesis who is threatening his life. So in that sense, it's not a duel with two equal protagonists. But then towards the end, the hero finds the courage and the ability to make it a duel and destroy the truck driver. In my novelette, the truck had gasoline in it, and when it went down, it exploded into flame. And obviously they chose to have the truck empty, and infinitely better to show in the slow motion all the way down the cliff to the bottom. It was marvelous, a marvelous sequence, and the sounds were incredible. I was at the Museum of Radio and Television. Billy Goldenberg, who did the music, was there, and I said, Billy, I don't want to offend you, but I don't think of the score for Duel as music. Is it music? And he said, no, it's not music. He said, Stephen spoke to me and said, I don't want music, I don't want melody, I just want noise, I want sounds. And that's the way he wrote the score, and tremendously effective. I was delighted that the film ended very much as the story did, where the man's exaltation is suddenly reduced as he realizes what he has just gone through and what he has just done. I wrote short stories and novels for a period of about 20 years. Duel was the last one. I didn't realize it, but the theme of my stories is one man against insuperable odds. I have repeated it over and over and over again. I didn't know it at the time. And by the time I wrote Duel, I did know it. And I thought, well, this is it. This is the ultimate of one man facing some terrible opposition. And so I stopped writing short stories then, and I never wrote any more.
When I first started out directing, I had no interest in starting out in television. I was really a snob about TV. I wanted to direct movies. I didn't want to start in television. But when I saw the reality of the situation, you know, I was 20 years old, going on 21 at the time, and I'd been offered a contract by a major studio here at Universal by Sid Sheinberg. And there wasn't a movie producer in the world that was going to give me a feature just because I wanted to direct film. And there were probably very few TV producers that would have given me a television show. So I quickly sort of reformed my kind of grandiose outlook and decided that I would fight real hard to start in television, kind of like a training ground. And if I did good there, maybe somebody would give me a movie. So I began training in television, and my first few shows were, God, the first thing I did, of course, was the Joan Crawford Night Gallery.
My abiding concern, Doctor, and my singular preoccupation is myself. 11 hours or 12, fewer or more, it makes no difference. I want to see something. Trees, concrete, buildings, grass, airplanes, color!
Sid Sheinberg kind of muscled me through the producers who weren't sure they wanted to hire me for that, because I was really a kid. I was 21, 22 years old at the time. It was crazy. After that, I didn't work for about a year. I actually took off a year from my contract and just did some writing. Came back a year later because a friend of mine, Gerald Friedman, was producing a series called The Psychiatrist, starring Roy Thinnes, and asked me if I wanted to direct a couple of them. And he actually offered me 2 out of 6. He had a 6-show commitment, and I directed the first one and the one in the middle. And that was a great experience. That was fantastic. And then I realized, wow, you can be creative in television, even though the time pressure is enormous and you've got to finish these, you know, these hour shows. In those days, we had 5 days for an hour. And yet you could get a lot done in a day's work. And of course, you know, it wasn't an 8-hour or 10-hour day. You know, we were shooting 14, 15-hour days just to get all the shots in. But it was a great experience for me to start out in TV that way. The Joan Crawford experience wasn't so pleasant because I had a lot of interference from everybody you can possibly imagine trying to save my ass. I didn't think it needed saving, but they did, and I went along with the ride. I realized, well, maybe it does need saving. Maybe I'm not doing a very good job, and I had a lot of people giving me advice, and I pretty much didn't want to be a maverick independent filmmaker screaming, I'm going back to New York to make underground films. So I just pretty much played by their rules. But in an interesting way, Jerry Friedman's offer for me to direct this hour episode of The Psychiatrist with no restrictions. He just said, hey, do whatever you want. Make it into a little art film. You can be new wave, you can be avant-garde, you know, as esoteric as you want to be. Do what you want to do with it. wow, you know, that was a wonderful piece of friendship and advice, and that's exactly what I did. I made a very strange, esoteric show out of the hour. And it proved to me that television was fun. It was a nice place to start working.
I've been expecting you. It was inevitable.
I was a journeyman TV director, and I was doing not a lot of shows. I didn't do a lot of television. I tried to pick and choose the shows that, in a strange way, it was kind of a conundrum, a catch-22. I was trying to pick and choose the shows they would offer me, because most television producers weren't interested in working with this kid. They were much more interested in the Christian Ibes and the Alex Singers and Virgil Vogel, who was a friend of mine and helped me a lot when I first got started. Richard Benedict, actor turned TV director, a wonderful director. I mean, these are really, you know, fine directors, but they had proven themselves again and again, so the television producers of the early 70s went to them before ever going to me. And of the few shows I was offered, I didn't care for it. I didn't like the scripts, didn't like the series themselves. But after kind of, you know, starving and needing to make a little money, I went back to Sid Sheinberg. I said, "Okay, Sid, I'll work. I'll just you know what I'm saying? I'll just sort of I'll work for my dinner." And he said, "Well, will you journeyman?" And I said, "Yes, I'll journeyman." So he got me a Marcus Welby.
Nobody, except Mr. Craddock here, the school nurse and your homeroom teacher, will know anything about the hemophilia. The boys and girls in your class will be told absolutely nothing.
But it's up to you to explain to them, or not to explain to them, why you'll be excused from certain activities.
Yeah, I can handle it.
That was a great experience for me. And I never directed Robert Young, but I was able to talk to him. You know what I'm saying? I was able, because he had his character. I'm not going to inform him or give him revisionist information about his character of Marcus Welby, but he was very, very gracious to me and not resentful of my age, which was such a problem in those days, especially in television, where the average age of a crew member was 55 years old, and it was all the great people from the golden age of movies that were now working in television that had already worked with all the great directors, and they didn't suffer fools or young people that well. So there was a lot of resistance to age in those days. So I was grateful when anybody gave me a job in television. No matter how pedestrian the concept of the show appeared, I was still able to do a couple of shots in an hour Marcus Welby that I was proud of. That I said, "Oh, I got away with that. Nobody fired me. That's great." And then when I met Bill Lincoln and Richard Levinson, who were the creators and producers of Columbo, and Stephen Bochco, who was writing for them at the time, and they asked me if I would do the first show of the season. It was a great honor to be invited to do that first show. And when I read the script by Bochco, and I guess story by Lincoln Levinson, I thought, man, this is the best script anybody has ever given me, ever, to direct. So I treated that like a little mini movie, and I made the movie with the psychology of a film director, not a TV director. I said, I'm going to make this look like, you know, within the time they're giving me, I'm going to make it look like $1 million. They're giving me $130,000 for this hour. I'm going to make it look like $1 million.
Is this your partner's handwriting? Well, I think I can prove it is. Maybe I ought to read this to you. Idea for a Melville book, perfect alibi. A wants to kill B. Drives B to a remote house and has him call his wife in city. Tells her he's working late at the office. Bang, bang.
Columbo was a great experience for me, and was as close as I had ever come to making a movie.
Well, it's about time, Charlie.
What I tried to bring to TV was a lesser emphasis on the close-up, because the movies I learned from were really about master shots and letting the audience kind of look at the overview and kind of be their own film editor sometime. I used to love those old movies like Orson Welles, certainly, and John Ford, you know, shot wide. Howard Hawks shot wide. But when Hawks and Ford went in for the close-up, it was to tell a story. It was to drum home a point. And they used the close-up as a powerful tool of narrative storytelling. Television seemed to use a close-up because screens were so small. They wanted people to see what the actors were saying. They wanted to get mouth movement, so they would shoot all the TV shows like that. So when I came to television, I kind of went back to wider shots, and it got me, in a strange way, you know, noticed. simply because I was shooting wider than most television directors. So I look back at it and say, you know, I was so hungry back then. I was so ambitious. I was so excited about having been given this chance. It was a great experience for me to start out in TV that way.